Imagine accepting the Academy Award and thanking the critic who tried to bury you by name. Picture the hush, the ripple of disbelief, the cameras angling for the smallest expression on a famously unreadable face. It is March 29, 1993. Clint Eastwood stands at the microphone at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, Oscar in hand, and says, plainly, "Peter, if you're watching, this Oscar is for you." The line lands like a dropped glass. Some laugh nervously, others stare. A man in Chicago, many miles away, realizes his words have found their target. If you love historic Oscar moments, like and subscribe. To understand why that brief, almost offhand remark became one of the most talked about moments in modern awards lore, you have to rewind to a gray September afternoon in 1992, when a respected critic at the Chicago Herald published a review that read like a verdict. Peter Hammond, known in his city for tough-minded criticism, read Unforgiven and declared not just dislike but dismissal. His review was sharp and personal. He called the film's tone pretentious and wrote that, in his view, Eastwood's directorial instincts had run their course. Among the stakes he laid down was the phrase that would boil into legend, an embarrassment to cinema. That sentence did what bold journalism sometimes does. It drew a line. It also lit a fuse. Hammond did not quietly walk back his words. In follow-up columns through the fall and winter, he doubled down, standing by his assessment as the film continued its slow, steady conversation with audiences and other critics. But his voice, authoritative in a regional market, increasingly found itself at odds with a chorus that sounded in a very different key. Roger Ebert and other prominent outlets praised the film for wrenching moral complexity and rigorous craftsmanship. The New York Times and Variety, among others, published reviews that put the movie on a trajectory toward respect, not ridicule. Audiences responded. Unforgiven went on to gross roughly $159 million worldwide. The industry took note. Award season chatter shifted from skepticism to serious consideration. By February 1993, Unforgiven had earned 9 Academy Award nominations. The path from scathing column to marquee recognition had been laid out in plain figures and headlines. Between the September review and the nominations, a curious psychological duel emerged. A critic publicly convinced of a film's failings, and a film quietly accumulating the very things his review had claimed it lacked: technical finesse, acting honors, and institutional approbation. For Hammond, each new accolade felt like salt added to an old wound. For Eastwood, each ticket sale and positive notice was the slow assembling of an answer that would not require melodrama, only time and work. Awards season has a peculiar logic. Momentum begets momentum. Early technical victories often preface the headline categories, and buzz circulates like currency. Unforgiven won attention where it mattered: editing, acting, and the respect of peers. Joel Cox, who edited the film, took home the Oscar for Best Film Editing. Gene Hackman won Best Supporting Actor for a performance that balanced menace and sorrow. Each trophy was a small public correction to the narrative that had pronounced Eastwood finished. The tension heading into March 29, 1993, was not just about ballots. It was about reputation. Whose assessment would history favor? Would the solitary, harsh critique echo more loudly than the broad, cumulative judgment of audiences and colleagues? On that night, the Academy Theater filled with people who had seen both the film and the debate it inspired. The evening proceeded with its normal ritualism: cameras, small talk, applause that rose and fell like ocean swells. Then, the moment arrived. Clint Eastwood's Best Director win was, for many, the shock. Not because it was implausible. Unforgiven had been the season's most discussed film, but because a man who had been so publicly scorned had taken the ceremony's highest directorial honor with the same compact, unadorned manner that marked his career. His acceptance speech was brief, characteristic, and measured. He named his collaborators with gratitude. He gave voice to the odd human business of criticism and creativity, and then, in a single, precise beat, he addressed the critic. "Peter, if you're watching, this Oscar is for you." The auditorium exhaled. Cameras panned the crowd, some laughed, some winced. To watch Hammond in Chicago, reportedly tuned into the live broadcast, was to see the collision of critic and consequence, a face gone suddenly pale, a realization that the stage had turned the review into an anecdote. The evening did not stop there. Best Picture followed. Unforgiven collected that honor as well. The film that had been called pretentious by one voice now carried two of Hollywood's highest trophies. That sequence, director, then picture, was not only a tidy sweep on the awards ledger, it was a narrative arc with its own dramaturgy. The man at the podium had been publicly doubted, and now, before millions, had been publicly recognized. The story might have ended with a recorded line and a few column inches. Instead, it acquired an image that would carry the episode into a longer cultural life. A photograph. Sometime after the ceremony, a still image circulated. Clint Eastwood holding two Oscars, the figure of a craftsman framed by the soft, gilded light of award season. On the photo, in his compact, unmistakable script, Eastwood wrote, "Thanks for the motivation. Still embarrassing cinema. Clint Eastwood." The words landed with a paradoxical mix of wryness and finality. It was not an invective. It was a controlled rejoinder, a private joke made public, and a small visual proof of the evening's outcome. The inscription echoed the critic's phrase but inverted its force. Where Hammond had used embarrassment to condemn, Eastwood used the word as a playful, almost rhetorical device, an acknowledgement of the critic's presence, even as he rejected the judgment behind it. The distribution of that photograph was itself a part of the statement. Prints made their way into the hands of columnists, into the circulation of papers, into the folders of industry insiders. Media coverage picked up the image and ran with the narrative. Review turned to rebuttal. Insult transmuted into souvenir. Reporters framed the picture as a composed, devastating rejoinder, and for many observers it embodied the evening's moral. Success can be the most public, and sometimes most satisfying form of answer. The immediate fallout for Peter Hammond was stark, though it must be stated carefully and within the lines history provides. Coverage at the time reported a swift diminishment in his standing, fewer invitations to high-profile panels, fewer seats at advanced screenings. The column inches that once amplified his voice started to shrink. A subsequent book did not sell as hoped. Over time, his influence within the national conversation about film waned. These outcomes, the demotion of prominence, the drying up of professional opportunities, are the kinds of consequences that follow public misjudgments in industries where reputation is currency. To be clear, the record shows a diminished public platform. It does not and cannot speak to private motives or inner life. For Eastwood, the arc continued upward. He did not rest on one ceremony. The work that had earned Unforgiven its acclaim did not vanish with the Oscars. More than a decade later, he would win further recognition for Million Dollar Baby in 2005, reinforcing a career-long narrative of a director who kept making films that challenged expectations, and often critics. Unforgiven itself settled into the canon, taught in film schools, cited in discussions of revisionist westerns and moral ambiguity, studied as much for its economy of storytelling as for its blunt moral engagement. What makes this episode worth retelling, what lifts it beyond gossip into something like lesson, is the way it reframes a familiar choice every artist must make when faced with public contempt. Fight back in words, or let work speak. Eastwood chose the latter, and then married that choice to a small theatrical flourish, a thank you on a public stage, and a signed photograph that converted criticism into narrative fuel. The result was a kind of elegant retaliation, not vicious, but undeniable. There is a tension here between ethics and theater. Critics perform a necessary role. They test, interpret, and sometimes provoke. When Hammond wrote his review, he was doing the work critics are expected to do: assess art, press its limits. But the public chorus matters too. A single voice, even a loud one, does not determine a work's fate when the industry, audiences, and peers speak differently. The Academy's nominations and votes did not nullify Hammond's right to his opinion. What they did was create a different kind of answer. institutional recognition that, in the court of public judgment, carries weight. The photograph, then, becomes symbolic in two ways. First, it is the record of a victory, a concrete object that says visually that the man who was criticized won the night. Second, it is the story's shorthand for a broader lesson about reputation. A critic's words can cut. The exercise of craft, when sustained and publicly acknowledged, can heal, or at least outlast, the cut. For students of film, the image functions as a case study, how a director managed not just to create a definitive work, but to navigate the social economy of criticism, awards, and legacy. To be careful, though, the story does not endorse smugness. Eastwood's inscription carried a wry edge, but it also displayed restraint. It did not descend into personal attack. It acknowledged the critic as participant in the story, not as enemy. That nuance matters because the ethics of response are part of the moral you take away. Composure and excellence, work refined to the point that it answers accusation by existing, often make the sharper counterargument than rancor. The industry's reaction in the weeks and months after the ceremony reinforced this reading. Coverage labeled Hammond's original review among the season's most spectacular misjudgments. Journalists and columnists used his verdict as a cautionary example about the hazards of overreach in criticism. Film schools and historians later pointed to the episode as a teachable moment about the interplay between criticism, publicity, and institutional endorsement. The photograph became a prop in lectures, a visual punchline, and a pedagogical tool. At the human level, the episode underlines how public life magnifies private errors. Critics write for audiences, and when their words misalign with collective judgment, exposure can be unforgiving. For Hammond, what followed was a decline in the platform he once occupied. For Eastwood, a career that had been punctuated by both hits and skepticism continued to accumulate weight, and to complicate the simplistic narrative of an actor-turned-director whose talents had peaked and faded. This is not a story that ends with one man's humiliation and another's coronation. It speaks to the rhythms of creative work, how confidence is earned, how reputations recalibrate, and how institutions like the Academy participate in the making of legacies. It also speaks to a personal philosophy about response. If your antagonist offers a harsh ruling, you can respond with a pamphlet, a retort, a lawsuit, or a cascade of temperament. Or you can continue to do what you do and let the results, public and durable, answer for you. Think of the moment as a small moral thriller. A critic throws down a gauntlet in September 1992. The film answers ticket by ticket and accolade by accolade. The Academy, in February and March of 1993, acts as a kind of referee. The stage supplies the dramatic encounter. The photograph supplies the epilogue. Between those points, the narrative makes its own claim about how careers are measured, not by single sentences in newspapers, but by cumulative, visible recognition. There is also an irony to it that is worth noticing. The critic sought to end a conversation. Instead, his words ensured he would be part of it for years. He was cited and debated in other reviews, and his misjudgment became a reference point. That is an occupational hazard in any field where commentary carries weight. To be sure, you may sway audiences, you may sharpen public taste, but you also risk being taught by history itself. Across the decades since, the image of Eastwood's 2 Oscars and that brief inscription has taken on a life of its own. It circulates in documentaries, in classroom slides, in retrospectives about the Academy, and the question of how we measure greatness in popular art. For young filmmakers, it is sometimes framed as a textbook example of responding with work. For critics, it is offered as a cautionary tale about balance and humility. For the general public, it remains a flavorful anecdote about celebrity, consequence, and the theatrical possibilities of a line delivered on live television. There is a final, quieter lesson beneath the spectacle: the durability of a well-made film. Unforgiven did not win because a man wanted revenge. It won because a group of peers judged it worthy. It won because its rhythms, its choices, its performances convinced people invested in its craft. In that sense, Clint Eastwood's comeback was not merely a personal vindication. It was a reaffirmation of a professional ethic. Make work that withstands scrutiny and time. When we say shocking comeback, we mean the surprise of seeing a public arc close in a way many did not expect. When we say proved the critics wrong, we mean that the cumulative, public recognition of peers, the box office, and historical reassessment contradicted a sharp negative conclusion. The story, clean and dramatic, remains instructive because it shows how public voices and institutional decisions can collide, and how sometimes the quietest answers are the most durable. There are no perfect moral verdicts to render here. Criticism remains vital. Reviewers must speak plainly when a film disappoints, but Hammond's fate, as reported, suggests a necessary humility. Words carry consequences, especially when you stake absolutes. Eastwood, for his part, offered not revenge but evidence in the form of craft and recognition. The signed photograph is the neatest, most theatrical summation of that strategy. Short, ironic, and undeniably effective. So when you think of that night in 1993, picture the small, incisive moments. The hush when a name was spoken. The man at home watching live. The applause that built into acceptance. The photograph sent around as a discreet, wry epilogue. Picture also the broader arc. A film that earned 9 nominations, earned $159 million, and entered the conversation about American cinema, in a way that persisted long after a single review faded. Clint's comeback was shocking, not because it was impossible, but because it defied the drama many expected. Instead of a public squabble, he chose a public body of work, topped by a brief, cool rejoinder and an image that turned the critic's insult into a keepsake. It was a lesson in composure, in the power of accolades to reshape narratives, and in how one carefully chosen reply, delivered with a smile on stage and a short inscription on a photograph, can reverberate for decades. If this story speaks to you, tell us. Which comeback in entertainment moved you the most? Share this video and leave a comment below.